Kia ora, everyone, and welcome to GeoHug. So before we kick off today's session, I'd just like to take this time to acknowledge the traditional lands which we're all coming from today. I live on the beautiful lands of the Gadigal of the people of the Aurora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and future. So I'm thrilled to have Kathleen Campbell joining us today. So Kathy is a geologist and astrobiologist who investigates extreme environments as analogues for early life on Earth and possible life on Mars. She teaches paleoecology, sedimentology, and astrobiology at the University of Auckland. She is an elected fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand's Te Aparangi and is the founding director of Te Ao Marama, the Centre for Fundamental Inquiry, a transdisciplinary research centre and in the Faculty of Science at the University of Auckland, where they're exploring the origin and evolution of the universe and its life. And I just cannot wait to hear from her today about the search for extraterrestrial life in the solar system. This is going to be an absolutely epic session. I hope you all enjoy it. Please use the chat and we'll open up the floor at the end. And yes, thank you so much, Kathy, for joining. I'm so grateful to have you here today.
Kia ora, Jess, and everyone. Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here and lots of fun to talk about these things. I'm actually going to a Raise the Bar event in a month or two in Auckland where people come to bars and drink and hear academics talk about their work. So this is a little test run for that, and no PowerPoint in that one. So we just have to go with the flow. So great to be here. And I have in the background the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge because that's near where I grew up. And I've been, I studied earth science and also ended up at NASA Ames Research Center in the Bay Area, looking at signatures of life, basically microbial life in the fossil record, and helping to us understand how we might search for signs of life, past or present, and in the solar system. And so I am going to talk about that today and a little bit of the journey around that. Here over in Auckland, where I've been for 25 years, strangely enough. I was coming for a few and I ended up staying. So it's been good. And I'm really excited about GeoHug. I think it was a great initiative. I only heard about it recently, but we certainly were stuck in lockdown for longer than just about everyone else. So I would have appreciated a bit of this during that time. It's nice to be free again. So I think if it's okay with you, Jess, I might share the screen and put the talk up. So what we're going to talk about is we're going to zoom in on searching for life. And I have to say that my perspective is that of a geologist. There are lots of different ways to do this kind of work. You can be an astrophysicist, a cosmologist. You can look at habitability of galaxies. You can look at the very origins of galaxies and the universe. You can do prebiotic chemistry. There's a lot of different ways to be searching for life. And of course, we use Earth as our example. And so I'm going to be talking a lot about what we call Earth analogs today. So the right kinds of environments that we think might host life in the solar system, past or present. And because we can't see any aliens, although I'll show you some drawings of some in a minute, we ourselves are looking really for the microbial signatures of life. So I want to talk a little bit about the extremes of life on Earth and what that tells us about searching for life elsewhere, and a little bit about my own personal journey in this way. So let me see now. Interesting. There. Good. So astrobiology then. I thought I'd start with a little definition. This is NASA has definitions about all kinds of things. So we're trying to understand the story of life in the universe in a holistic sense. That's why there's so many different ways. There's philosophers, ethics people, lots of different people who study astrobiology. And sure, the discovery of life elsewhere, of another version of life, would be great. And it certainly brings up lots of fundamental questions, which we'll get to in a minute. And some of the areas start from, say, prebiotic chemistry to the origin or origins of life on Earth, our only example of life, how it's evolved and adapted, where are we searching elsewhere, and what's the future of life on Earth and elsewhere. So we cover all those topics in our courses here, and most astrobiologists come from a range of disciplines. So some of the big questions that are being sought, which I'm sure we've all thought about, is where are we alone in the universe? And that question, when you look at, say, a long exposure like this by astrophysicists, and you see that this is only a fraction of a millionth of the sky, and there are thousands and thousands of galaxies here, so more than 2 trillion estimated galaxies in the universe, it's kind of a statistical inevitability that some of them must have Earth-like planets. And we will, people didn't know for sure until we actually found the first exoplanets in 1995, but scientists knew that it had to be a statistical inevitability. And before that, way back at the times when it wasn't okay to have the Earth anywhere but in the middle of the universe as a center, and in those times, anybody who speculated about other planets were burned at the stake. So luckily, we don't do that these days, and we can proceed with this question. So I'm sorry, I'm playing around a little bit because my my little computer, doesn't want to forward, but I think I found a way to do it. So here's another question that we think a lot about, and that is, how did life on Earth originate, and what was early life on Earth like? Because maybe we'll see signs of this somewhere else. And so when we go to some fossils over in Australia and the Bitter Springs site, everybody agrees that these 900 million year old features are microbes. In fact, they're cyanobacteria, so photosynthesizing bacteria, what used to be called blue-green algae, but they are actually bacteria, giving off oxygen and producing the atmosphere that we now live and breathe in today. But going back even further, this is a painting from the Smithsonian Institute, and you'll see this little yellow stuff around this hot spring, or these stromatolites, which I'll talk more about, the earliest fossils, fossil buildups. This is sort of a rendition of what early life back in the Archean era was like, according to these people thinking about these things. But really, what environments they're in, when you go further back in time to the origin of life, which was somewhere around 4 billion years ago, it's when things get sketchy and people have big bun fights about this, especially in some of the older rocks, for example, in Western Australia or in Greenland or in South Africa, where these continental cores exist today and are still preserved. And of course, here's my alien, one of my 2 aliens in this talk. Was there life on other planets? Is there life on other planets? What would it look like? And where should we go to look for it? So a lot of what we're going to talk about is Mars. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll understand why a lot of people are spending a lot of money exploring Mars, because that's one of the main foci of what we'll talk about today. Here's some more aliens. And so asking this question of what does extraterrestrial life look like, or could it look like? I think we all know for sure that despite all the sci-fi movies, that we haven't seen any signs so far of intelligent life from space, either visually or listening, for example, with SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrials Institute, listening for radio signals, just like the radio signals that we're sending out into space all the time because of our communication systems. So yes, there's lots of sci-fi, but really, certainly in our own solar system, we are generally looking for microbial life because we don't see signs of intelligent life or technosignatures in our solar system. Technosignatures might be further out. And afterwards, if any of you want to chat a little bit about technosignatures, please ask. I have a little bit of knowledge about that. I'm not going to talk too much about it in the talk, though, because my focus is on the solar system and how it is that we go out and search, because, you know, the solar system is a really big place, and there are lots and lots of rocks and ice and celestial bodies out there. So how do we narrow down the search? And so I want to focus on that and really come down to the extreme limits of life on Earth, because we are in what we call the Goldilocks zone. So not too hot, not too cold, and life is everywhere we look. It's in cold and hot places. It's in acid, alkaline, salty, in the deep subsurface down 3.5 kilometers, living just on hydrogen and water in tiny, tiny cracks. And maybe those microbes down there are only reproducing like 1 cell per 1,000 years, but they are alive. And so we use this extreme environment limits on life, the limits of our biospace, to push to push the limits of where we can explore for it in our solar system. And then even beyond that, when we start looking for exoplanets, which I'll talk about right at the very end. So this is some weird microbes living in a hypersaline, which means super salty pond. So there's no grazing organisms that have evolved since about 540 million years ago. And it used to be that microbial mats lived all over the surface of Earth. And some of those microbial mats were giving off oxygen as a waste product, which of course created the oxygen of our atmosphere. We're on our third atmosphere of Earth right now. And this is the one that we can live in. But these other organisms, these more primitive and early organisms, were living in anaerobic, so no oxygen atmosphere, and were eating all kinds of weird things, Earth's geochemicals, and eventually figured out how to use the sunlight to photosynthesize. And that's when things really started to take off, because there's a lot of energy in being able to do that. So I do work in extreme environments, and there's a few examples here of what we call Earth analog extreme environments where microbial life flourishes. So microbes are way better than multicellular life. Single-celled microbes are way better at living at the extremes on Earth. And this is just a little list of a few of those extremes, including the hydrothermal vents in the deep sea, rocks in the rocks of the dry valleys of Antarctica, and over here on the right, the largest hot spring in Yellowstone. So this is a walkway, and those little tiny dots are people, just to give you a sense of it. And all those colors are all different microbes living at high temperatures. So this is what people are often talking about, and often they look at, it's not the only thing, but often people look at the temperature extremes of life to try to imagine the conditions of both early life on Earth as a way to think about how life might take hold on a celestial body, and then possibly where else that might have happened. And so the upper temperature limit of life on Earth at the moment is at 121 to 122 degrees Celsius in hydrothermal vents. And so we'll come back to these extreme environments throughout this talk. Now, there's also this question of hydrothermal environments and the origin of life. And so we have the tree of life with 3 domains shown here: archaea, bacteria, these are all prokaryotes, and then the eukaryotes, which are both single-celled as well as multicellular life. And we're way up here in this corner. Jess, can you give me a thumbs up that you can see my little pointer? Awesome. Thank you. I'll try not to wiggle it around too much. And so what I wanted to show you in this tree of life is that there are these groups that are in purple, the branches that are the deepest or the most primitive roots of the tree of life. And they are hyperthermophilic, which means very hot water loving organisms. And you can see that in the bacteria and the archaea, we have a whole bunch of branches down there at the bottom. And so people have said, hey, this must mean that when the early solar system had a lot of bombardments, it was cleaning up all the debris of making planets. We had a lot of impacts. The Earth was much hotter. We had much hotter, higher temperatures. Our lavas were much hotter than they are today. They erupted at higher temperatures. And so, gosh, you know, life had to have taken hold at high temperature. And they even have suggested with this little bit down here, going to the last universal common ancestor, or LUCA, which would be the origin organism, that even LUCA, it was very hot, heat loving. And that's a hypothesis. That's not in any way proven. And these hot water loving organisms live both on land in terrestrial hot springs as well as in the deep sea around hydrothermal vents today. So these are the most primitive living things. And so the idea of using the tree of life, of living things, to try to understand where we came from is an idea that's been around for a while. The thing is, though, that when you really look at what's going on and you look at a more, I don't know, a microbiologist view of the tree of life, you see that the tree of life is not just branching. It also has horizontal branches or horizontal connections, and that's horizontal gene transfer happening. And it turns out that this then can be used to question whether, hey, maybe there's just a lot of horizontal gene transfer between the archaea and the bacteria. And that horizontal gene transfer down here just makes it look like there was thermophilic life everywhere. But in fact, it's just migrated into other branches of the tree of life. So that has been questioned, and there are studies in the microbiology sphere quite technical that talk more about, hey, maybe life originated mesophilically, which means sort of mid-temperature. So that's still being debated to this day. But I did want to point out that when we look at rocks, which is what I do, there are rocks in the really old cratons or the kernels of continents that are quite old, that are contain fossils that were in habitats that were hydrothermal, so hot water hydrothermal. And so one over here in Western Australia in the Pilbara Craton, where we do some work, are these little filaments. They're little iron bacteria filaments preserved in rock that most people say, yep, that's a filamentous or long, skinny, stringy thingy, filamentous microbe. And over here are these biofilms, this sort of streaky stuff from the Barberton greenstone belt in South Africa. And GA means gigaannum, which is 10 to the 9 years. So that's billions of years for Magic Mike, since you were talking about billions earlier. So yeah, we're going way back in time here and finding evidence for life. Biofilm, just to differentiate, is the stuff that's secreted by microbes. It's like snot, and it keeps the microbes kind of happy in their environment and not having to deal with so many extremes of temperatures or chemistry. So this is supposedly mineralized biofilm from South Africa. So that kind of brings me to what I do, and then I'll go back to what we're doing in the solar system. So I accidentally, as a master's student at the University of Washington, because I'm from the US, as you can tell from my accent, I accidentally stumbled across an extreme environment in the geological record as a master's student, not having any idea what I was very much doing. I was just doing a paleoecology, paleoenvironment standard study, and came across an area that had a lot of weird fossils in it. And I'm talking about weird clams and some weird sediments. And I didn't know what they were, so I was trying to learn more about biology, and I sat in on a zoology course at the University of Washington as a master's student, and this was an undergrad course. And one day the professor put up a picture of a clam, a living thing, and it looked exactly like what I had been working on in the geological record. And it was an area I just couldn't explain the depositional environment. It was a marine sequence of rocks. Anyway, I went up to this guy afterwards and I said, hey, you know what? I think I've got a load of this stuff. And he said, great. These are living in methane seeps offshore in a subduction zone where the Pacific Juan de Fuca plate is subducting beneath North America. And I was like, great, that's where I'm working. And I think I have a fossil version of this that's about 3 million years old. And that started me on the journey of studying chemosynthesis in the geological record. I had discovered one of the first fossil hydrocarbon seep deposits in the geological record, where hydrocarbons are coming out of the seafloor and really strange organisms are living around them, just like in the hydrothermal vents in places where the plates split apart. But I was working in a place where the oceanic plate dives beneath a continental plate, and then all this organic oil and gas leaks out and weird communities live around them. And that started my whole career, my PhD, got me to NASA, a whole bunch of things. It's one little clam. And while I was at NASA, my supervisor said, oh, I work at hot springs. I'm happy to have you work in cold springs or cold seeps, but he invited me to go to Yellowstone, and I went on my first trip to Yellowstone. And when I moved to New Zealand, no one was really working on hot springs from an astrobiology point of view, because there are places in the solar system that have hot water and volcanism. Certainly in the past, Mars was a place like that. And so he was working on that very problem. So I took that problem and brought it to New Zealand. And then I began to work with colleagues all around the world. And one of the places I spend a lot of time in is this lower picture in Argentina, in Patagonia, which is Jurassic in age, 150 million year old rocks that also had hot springs. So imagine a Yellowstone National Park that is about the size of Yellowstone National Park, but is in the Jurassic, and it marks the opening of the South Atlantic Ocean back 150 million years ago. And when the crust thinned as the ocean opened, the continental crust thinned, then hot springs popped up everywhere, like exactly what we have in New Zealand today. So we thought, wow, these might be great stepping stones into deep time, going back into the Archean to look at the microbes that live in these hot springs and their adaptations. And maybe that will help us search for early life on Earth and life on Mars. So that's how I got involved with all of this stuff. And it's what I continue to do here in New Zealand. And if you haven't been to New Zealand, then I really do recommend coming. There are beautiful hot springs here, and this is one of my favorites at Arake. And all of the colors that you see are microbial mats in these hot springs. The stepped topography is because of faulting, active faulting, and the hot fluids are coming up along the faults and way down 1, 2, 3, 4 kilometers. So not super deep is a magma chamber, making everything quite hot. And so the groundwater is circulating from the rain, getting heated up, and it comes up in hot springs along the fault. And all this white stuff that you see is an actual deposit from the hot springs coming from the dissolved ions that dissolve the volcanic rocks and precipitate a silica-rich deposit known as opaline silica. And that makes these hot spring deposits. And the extremophile organisms that are living in these hot springs become entombed very quickly in the silica, and they turn into fossils. So they turn to stone, and that's how we get them preserved. So the environment is perfect for turning them into rock, which means it's a perfect place to look for life, fossil life in the solar system, if you have a place that has volcanoes and running water at the surface, which Mars did more than 3 billion years ago. So these are what some of these things look like. So I wanted to say a word again about this thing I mentioned earlier, these stromatolites, which are buildups of microbial mats and sediments. Shark Bay in Australia is really famous for these things because it's a very salty lagoon, and so those grazing organisms that would eat the mats are not there. Back in the Archean, we didn't have snails that would graze these mats or any other organisms that would eat mats because they didn't exist yet. It was only a microbial world. So here at Arake, on the edge of the map of Africa, we see stromatolites growing in the pool. They're these columnar things, and the green shows that they're photosynthesizing. When they get close to the surface, they start to grow over the top as well, and they kind of merge all together. They're quite beautiful, and they make these layers. And as soon as they dry out, you can see that they're full of silica. The silica is actually entombing them, and they turn into rock very, very quickly. The other thing I'll say about them is that the orange color at the surface, now if I were in my class right now, I'd be asking you guys all these questions, but I will tell you that the orange color at the surface is when the mats are too close to the surface, they get sunburned. And so what they do is they put on a sunscreen, and that sunscreen is a carotenoid pigment, just like the pigment that is in carrots, carotenoid, and it's orangey yellow, and it's UV protection. So when you go deep in the pool, that's like a few meters deep, they turn green because they're photosynthesizing and they're giving off oxygen. But when they get close to the surface, they turn orange because they need to have sunscreen to not get burned by the UV radiation. All these adaptations that happened, billions of years ago. So here's one of these little growths, stromatolite growths, and there's some microbial mats. Here's some of this exopolymeric substance, which is the biofilm. It's basically snot, and it becomes silicified too. And so you get these buildups, and we use Raman microscopy here. And this is a quartz sinter hot spring deposit called sinter that is building up these stromatolites. And the green you can see in the Raman is carbon. So that's the microbial mat. And then it keeps growing as this whole deposit builds up into a hot spring deposit. So this is a fossil example. And this is what we're looking for, of course, on Mars, as well as in the earliest life on Earth, because everybody's fighting to find the earliest life on Earth. That's anytime a paper is published saying that you have the earliest life on Earth, I can guarantee you that there will be a lot of people looking at that very closely. So what you can do with these hot spring deposits is you can take them and you can march back in time and take a look to see how the microbial material gets preserved through time. So this is a very young hot spring deposit at a place called Tokanu, and you can see the microbial mats, and you can still see the pigment. You can still see the orange. So this mat grew on this substrate, and there was a hot spring flowing over this surface, and we know it's 60 years old for various reasons that I won't get into here. And so it's all silicified, it's all turned into stone, but it's baby rock. I like to call that baby rock because it's barely a rock. It's just formed a few years ago. Then you can go into Patagonia and find these same kind of microbial mat features. both with light microscopy and Raman microscopy. And again, you can see the same color scheme. The green is carbon and the orangey stuff is quartz. So this opal that comes out in the original hot springs eventually recrystallizes to quartz over time. And then you can march back even further, and this is where things get a bit more controversial. This is our work in the Dresser Formation in the Pilbara Craton. This is 3.5 billion year old material, and maybe this is microbial mat, but all the organic material gone. Very difficult to prove just based on textures whether this was actually some of the earliest life on Earth. But it is in a deposit that we interpret or infer as hot spring related. So once you get into the deep time stuff, whoa, people start getting pretty antsy about what you say. And so I'll just show you, this is work we've done in the in Western Australia in the Pilbara, looking at present day formation of this silica-rich material that gets formed around the vents. It forms a rock that we call geyserite because it forms in geysers. And this is this in the left-hand corner, this 3.5 billion year old material that we've interpreted as geyserite in our studies. And we've done some clean drilling out there, and I have a student working on characterizing the setting for early life because there's stromatolites also associated with this geyserite. Why this is so important is because geyserite forms at the surface of the land, so it's not underwater. It has to form subaerially, meaning at the interface between water and air. And so this means that the land mass out there was emergent at the time when people debate, you know, how much land area was there? And it also suggests that maybe life could have originated on land instead of the sea, which is the opposite of what everybody thinks. And so there is this hot spring origin of life hypothesis where we start with steps going through hot springs and life originating somewhere in the hot springs through prebiotic chemistry and the interaction with micrometeorites that bring in and comets that bring in carbon from outer space. And then in that, there is this sort of cycling of nutrients. Somewhere in here, life originates and then eventually is brought out to the sea. The exact opposite of the hydrothermal vent model, which has its problems because of dilution in the ocean. How do you concentrate and make something in a side of a cell if you're in a big ocean? Hot springs, on the other hand, wet and dry all the time. And so those are perfect places to create proto cells. So there's a whole industry that has sprung up around academically around this origin of life hot spring hypothesis, which shown here, you can see the typical sea to land version and the version that I myself and others think might be perhaps the better option is actually optimal origin of life on land as soon as there's bits of land somewhere, and then eventually the oceans being the actual extreme place where it's hard to take hold because there's so much water. How do you then encapsulate all your nutrients and everything and all your cellular machinery and not get just washed away? So that's something that's going on. So now you've got all the background info on what you need to help us search for life elsewhere. And so, because this is all the basics, and I'll focus for a little while now on Mars, and then what I'll do toward the end is wrap up a few other locations in the solar system and talk a little tiny bit also about exoplanets. But I want to kind of focus on Mars for a bunch of reasons. And one of the big ones for us is that more than 3 billion years ago, we have plenty of evidence in the old rocks on Mars that there were volcanoes, the largest, some of the largest in the solar system, and liquid water running. The largest canyon carved by water in the solar system. And so you've put water together with volcanoes and you should get surface hot springs. So if life originated perhaps in hot springs on Earth, or at least are adapted to extreme environments on hot springs on Earth, then gosh, you know, maybe there's life on Mars preserved in those rocks. And so in fact, there was a rover in the 2000 Spirit rover that was wandering around Gusev Crater in the Columbia Hills, and it came to this volcanic ash deposit known as Home Plate. You can see it's 80 meters wide. It's sort of whitish in this image from space, and Spirit rover is right here. It eventually died over somewhere else in this valley to the west, but where it is in this picture is over here. And the dashed lines show the distribution based on the rover driving around, of silica-rich deposits that the rover found by accident. I don't know if you remember, but Spirit was the rover that got its rear wheel jammed. And so the engineers turned the rover backwards and it drove backwards. And so it dragged its rear wheel. And so this is a rear wheel tire drag mark in the in the Martian soils. And you can see that it opened up a fresh area of white stuff. And that white stuff is silica. And it's not just silica, it's opaline silica. It's the silica that forms in hot springs before on Earth it goes through plate tectonics and burial and all kinds of fluid flow and turns into quartz. On Mars, this silica is still opaline more than 3.5 billion years since it first formed. And volcanic ash means, well, there were volcanic hot material somewhere nearby. So this is the place. And the work that was done prior to my getting involved with it was done by a couple of colleagues, where they were looking at the instruments on board that rover, thermal emission spectra. And here in black is this thermal emission spectrum of the home plate silica outcrop, showing this opal A plus some other weird thing that took them a long time to realize was halite or salt. And these hot springs, especially the ones that form in under alkali chloride conditions, chloride, salt. And so you get salt. And in fact, on Earth, where it's very dry, not in New Zealand where it rains all the time, but on Earth where it's very dry, these hot spring deposits, known as sinters, silica-rich deposits, like in Chile in the Atacama Desert, high elevation, low rainfall, you end up with hot springs that look really similar, and they're full of halite too. So in the Chilean ones, there are microbes, this sort of browny green stuff in the outflow channels of the springs, which in Chile have microbes in them, of course, just like they do in New Zealand and Yellowstone. And so the hypothesis is really that this finger-like stuff, this finger-like shaped silica deposits on Mars that they found with the rover, which are shown on this left-hand column here, might actually be stromatolites, little stromatolites made out of sinter or silica-rich opal, and maybe would have microbes in them. We don't know. So my colleagues, Steve Ruck and Jack Farmer, proposed that we should be going back there and getting samples. And so for the Mars 2020 mission, I got brought in at about the year 2016, 2017, and the final three was our location to go back to Gusev Crater in Columbia Hills or to go to some other spots. And so we were involved actually with arguing for the case to go back to hot springs on Mars, to collect samples and bring them back. So to study them properly on Earth, because you can't really tell on Mars. If we're fighting over Archean rocks here on Earth, then you really have to bring the samples back from Mars if you want to know if there was life in those finger-like or digitate, like digits, hot springs. So I thought I'd show you the little model for those of you who are geologists. This is a facies model, which is basically a fancy way to say the aspects of the rock that tell you about its environmental setting. And all of these words here are textural descriptions of different rock types that form in these hot springs. They're all made out of this stuff called sinter, which is a siliceous or silica-rich hot spring deposit. And near the vent, you form geyserite. And then as you go down the channels into the pools, like I showed you, you get here's these deep pool stromatolites we saw earlier, and you can go down the outflow channels out into the marsh. And in Yellowstone, you have marshes and plants and things like that, and they're all becoming silicified. And so we have a high temperature end of the system and then a lower temperature end, and different microbial communities live all the way from one end to the other, and they all have different textures. And so the digitate structures are found in a couple of locations, but always in association with flowing water and easy access to the air surface, so the air-water interface. So here's this is the example from Chile, and these are rather knobby, so gnarled up, knobby digitate structures. And then here's some from New Zealand that are more needle-like. So there's a range from needle-like to more knobby, but they're all made out of this silica, and they're all full of microbes on Earth. So this is the model for those finger-like projections from Mars. The other thing I wanted to point out, because we were involved with actually trying to pitch this mission to NASA, are there any other features present in retrospect, because the rover died in 2010 and there was no more work to be done there. And so there is, in fact, 80 meters from home plate. So here's home plate. There's 80 meters to the west. There is this mound-like thing, and it's called Pioneer Mound. And if you look at this is now false color on Mars to help bring out the basalt rocks, which are that blue tone. And then this, the ones that are coming out reddish are actually not iron, they're silica. So this coloration is for silica. And so this is perhaps a silica-rich mound on Mars that is, in fact, looking very much like it could be perhaps a vent, an old extinct hot spring vent mound. And so Steve Ruff went to Chile and looked at some extinct vents. Here's one with the same scale. And so this is what these rocks look like. So yeah, you could walk right past them if you don't know what you're looking at. It just looks like a pile of rock. But of course, we all know, anybody who's here who's a geologist knows that rocks tell lots of stories if you know how to read them properly. So this is a fossil version, like sub-recent, we would call it. And this is one that's actually active at the same scale here in Chile. So actively forming sinter vent mounds, and with these thick mats, are ubiquitous. So this is the model for, like, if you went back to Mars, where we would go to Pioneer Mound, and we would go back and collect some of those digitate structures. So back in 2017, at the third landing site meeting, NASA was considering 8 different locations on Mars. The older rocks are down here in the south on Mars. And Columbia Hills is where the arrow, the number 2 is. And they were also looking at Jezero Crater, where they are, in fact, today. And that's a delta, so that's number 1. And then number 2 is Columbia Hills, and then number 3 is this Northeast Syrtis Major. And so we were pitching this landing site at this workshop. You do this in front of a bunch of engineers and scientists, and then everybody kind of votes, and then there's an executive committee that kind of decides who goes forward. And I have to say, it was a huge fight to keep Columbia Hills in there, because NASA absolutely did not want to go back to any place, because that would be boring. So I like to say that our group was like the original Star Trek series, Mr. Spock, with our tricorders wanting to go back and revisit a site with new information and having the best science possible, and then getting those samples back. And NASA is more like Captain Kirk, wanting to explore the next planet and the next solar system. And so, of course, Captain Kirk won, and they got to go to a place that we think is not the ideal location to look for signs of life on Mars, but that's, of course, my group. But we really had a lot of fun. This is the 2017 group, and then there were some more people also involved from Australia and New Zealand and the US, including a guy from high school who is now studying planetary science, but he was in high school at the time when he joined our group. So here are the other locations. I've already mentioned Columbia Hills to you, and you can see that on the far right-hand screen of this map of Mars, and you can see Jezero Crater and Northeast Syrtis Major. These were the final 3 that went into the 2018 workshop. The mission was to explore a site likely to have been habitable and seek evidence of past life. So Northeast Syrtis is like an impact crater with a bunch of hydrothermal minerals, but unclear whether it was ever at the surface or whether these were deep, hydrothermal circulations. And then the poster child for the Jezero Crater team, which sold it, was this picture of a delta from outer space. You can see the river system coming into a crater, and there would have been a lake, because that is a delta for sure. And there are actually older delta deposits around here, and this is the younger part of the delta. Now, when one of my colleagues from Australia actually pointed out that doing all kinds of comparative analysis showed quite clearly that this delta was too young for the long water flowing phase of Mars's history, and was only a part of its second phase, which was the colder, drier phase, where there were occasional outburst floods, that was poo-pooed at the meetings until several years later, when someone published a paper and said, gosh, this delta is kind of young. it's actually in the wrong phase to be looking for sustained life. Because imagine giant outburst floods forming a delta. It's not the ideal place for life to actually take hold and hang out for a while. And their target is some carbonate deposits as well as some distal deltaic deposits, which will be more muddy, and they are more muddy. And of course, they've sampled both now the muds as well as the carbonates. But yeah, the first paper that was published about this was, I think, in Science or Nature, and said, hey, we found a delta. And the rest of us went, yeah, we can see that from space, but good on ya. So they do have a delta. I hope they find life. They're hoping to find stromatolites. I don't know whether they will. But I'm really proud of the work that we did, because we worked hard. We were the underdogs, and we definitely had the best science score. But in the end, really, NASA is spending $7 billion on this mission. It's a two-part mission. It's the first part is the Perseverance rover and the Ingenuity helicopter, and that is collecting the samples. And then there'll be a second mission to go and get them. And then they're building a sample analysis facility that's, really high end and has so that there can be no escape of Martian microbes into the Earth's atmosphere. So they are really going to spend a lot of money on it, which of course, I understand that they would want to spend a lot of money on it, and they're going to find amazing things. But my team probably feels that perhaps it's not the best place to look for life, but they'll certainly find a lot of really interesting things about Mars's history here. And so here we see, of course, this spectacular landing, the incredible helicopter that's flying in an atmosphere that's less than it's about 1% of the Earth's atmosphere, which is a very difficult thing to do. And so it's really amazing science, what's going on there for sure. So now I just want to spend a few minutes just pointing out where else you might look for life in the solar system. And one way you can do this is actually look for meteorites from Mars. And so one place besides the deserts of Africa or of Australia, actually, you can also go to Antarctica. And here they found ALH 84001 in 1984. It was the first meteorite found. And it took quite about a decade for them to realize that meteorite was from Mars. Some of you might wonder why and how do they know it's from Mars, and we can chat about that later if you want. So it's about the size of a potato. I've seen it. I went to give away some money from the National Science Foundation many years ago now, and they brought it in a little vacuum sealed dome, and it was attached in a suitcase to a guy with handcuffs. And that guy had to take it into the bathroom with him, and he couldn't have it out of his sight. And so we got to touch it, not physically, but the dome, we could put our hand on the dome, and it's the size of an ugly gray potato. But that is a very important rock because in 1996, it was claimed to show signs of life on Mars in rocks that were more than 3 billion years old. There's a bunch of really interesting things about that meteorite that we could talk about later, but here's a picture of this thing that might be a filament that was studied from that meteorite. There were other lines of evidence they used to try to explain that it might be fossils, but people came back and said, hey, those are way too small to have been alive. That must be an artifact of the sample preparation because bacteria on Earth are much larger. And a bunch of other things kind of came down around it, and people in general don't believe that that meteorite had signs of life, but it galvanized searching for life on Mars after this find. So what's happening on Mars at the moment, and no, that is not me on the lower right. I have no interest in going to Mars. I don't want to die there. But the sample return mission will be back in the 2030s. So the surface samples are, they're caching them inside the rover, and they're also dropping them in certain drop locations. And they're about the size of your thumb and about, this 10 centimeters long. So they're reasonably large samples, actually. So those samples will come back, and then there are planned human missions to Mars after we get onto the moon between the 2030s and more likely the 2050s. So that's happening. So maybe we can just go to Columbia Hills and pick up the Digitate Center and bring it back and prove once and for all whether there was any life there. We'll see. All right, so the last few minutes then, I just want to say a few words about where else to search for life in the solar system. We've been talking about the Goldilocks zone, which is pretty much Venus, Earth, and Mars. And I just want you to notice that the Goldilocks zone is the habitable zone away from the sun in terms of how much solar influx there is and how much heat. So back, several billion years ago, Venus was in the Goldilocks zone, but it is not in the Goldilocks zone on the surface anymore. And Mars is sort of marginally in the habitable zone. It's pretty cold. So there are dark streaks in the clouds of Venus. Some people have said maybe those dark streaks might harbor microbes that are actually living up in the clouds, because maybe they've migrated from when Venus had oceans. All of that has now been, burned off pretty much and is just stuck in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And a lot of other things have escaped into space. So it was in the Goldilocks zone. And so Rocket Lab, which is over here in New Zealand, is planning to launch the first private Venus mission. They say in this article that it's May 2023, but I haven't heard whether it's really going to be going in May. That's pretty soon. But they're thinking of dropping a little probe and to measure what's going on in the atmosphere. And that's partly driven by, in 2020, the discovery of this chemical phosphine in pH3, so phosphorus and hydrogen, in non-equilibrium abundances in the atmosphere of Venus, measured by a couple of telescopes on Earth. And so they were like, okay, there's something weird going on with the chemistry. Maybe Venus has weird chemistry, and it's got in unequilibrium levels of phosphine, or it was produced by life, because we get phosphine by life here on Earth that's in non-equilibrium abundance, or maybe it was measured wrong. And by 2021, other studies pretty much showed that this might be sulfur dioxide, which is everywhere in Venus's atmosphere and definitely does not look like it's a sign of life. So whether or not they're still going to be going to Venus, there are missions actually planned to go to Venus to check out the atmosphere, where of course it's cooler than the surface of the planet today. So that's Venus in a nutshell. Where else can we go? Well, how about out where it's beyond the Goldilocks zone? Could there be little micro Goldilocks zones going on inside of the planet somehow, or moons out there in the ice worlds, the gas giants way out on the edge of the solar system? Well, it's obviously really, really cold on the surface of those places, but what if you went underneath the surface? And so one of the first places people started to consider was Europa, one of Jupiter's moons. And it's got this really weird scratch marks all over the surface, and some weird nutrients that are the other colors that you see there. And remember, this little moon is in the gravitational pull of Jupiter. So Jupiter might be massaging this little moon to the point where underneath the ice that's on the surface, that there's actually an ocean underneath. And there are several moons in the Jovian system of Saturn and Jupiter that have ice at the surface and water underneath. And this cracking of the ice think of it as ice tectonics. So the ice is being moved around because there's liquid water underneath it. So here's an artist's rendition of a probe that somehow got through all the ice, and they found some sort of hydrothermal vent that is being kept warm on the surface of the bottom of this ocean. So this is the idea that they have. Now, how thick is the ice? Well, somewhere between 15 and 25 kilometers thick. So you've got people trying to invent probes that can then melt their way through and sample the oceans. But also in those locations where there are cracks, we actually have geysers shooting water ice into space because it immediately freezes. And they've measured on one of the Saturn moons, they've actually flown through it and measured some very interesting elements like silica and some other stuff. So that tells you there might be some nutrients down there in that water. So in the meantime, before the tunneling concept where you put a lander and you stick it in one of these cracks, before that happens, there are missions, the European Space Agency and NASA have missions launching soon to do flybys and studies as precursors to lander missions that would come much later. So Hubble Space Telescope looked like it imaged geyser plumes coming off of Europa some years ago. And then we have Enceladus, which is one of Saturn's moons. And this is an incredible photo from the Cassini mission of Enceladus, one of the tiny little moons. It's only can't remember, but it's a few hundred to 1,000 or something kilometers thick. We can look at the, diameter. We can look at how big it is. It's little. And here are the rings, and it's out in one of the E rings. I think it's the E ring out on the outer edge of Saturn. Same thing, the magnetic field and the gravity are sort of massaging Enceladus, and Enceladus has geysers that have been actually imaged with Cassini that are shooting stuff into space through those cracks. It's amazing. So of course there's going to be missions to Enceladus to try to see if maybe down here we have the Earth-like hydrothermal vent model, warming up the water and maybe circulating life in the deep sea of Enceladus with water rock interactions, just like we have in the hydrothermal vents here on Earth today. There's other aspects of this that I won't get into here, but these models of either methane seeps or hydrocarbon seeps or hydrothermal vents are actually being used now to justify some very expensive missions going to Jupiter and Saturn. And we also, of course, remember, we have our Antarctic or other Earth analog environments to look for life in the solar system in these sort of weird sub-ice worlds. And so Antarctica has subglacial lakes. These are extreme environments underneath ice thicknesses of up to 4 kilometers. And clathrates are basically frozen methane and water. And there's microorganisms, inorganic particles, gases, and ions that are circulating. This little drawing of a hydrothermal vent is a big fat question mark. I don't know where they got that idea from, but there it is. But the idea is that indeed, and we know for sure there is life. Here's a picture on the left. There's life under the ice. And so there are missions to the icy worlds of our solar system planned to look for life. One of the final things I wanted to mention is Titan, which is one of Saturn's other moons. This is shrouded in sort of a fog, a haze of hydrocarbon gases. And Titan is completely crazy because instead of rocks, it has frozen boulders of ice, water ice, and it's got actual lakes and shorelines of liquid methane and ethane and even weather patterns that are really similar to today. And so they put a little probe on the Cassini mission and they dropped it and it flew down through Titan because they couldn't see anything, remember, because of all the haze. It's like if you burned a bunch of fossil fuels and then you just had pollution. That's basically what Titan's atmosphere is like. And so this is a false color image on the left, and the blue is the methane that is actually liquid at these low temperatures. It's liquid. And there are shorelines. That's a photograph taken from the probe of a shoreline with river systems full of methane, liquid methane. And you can see on the right, these boulders that are made out of water ice. So it's a completely crazy world. It's probably a world of prebiotic chemistry full of hydrocarbons, but that doesn't mean that there's life there. But people are interested in it in terms of the amount of carbon that's in the solar system, that an entire moon could be just full of this stuff. And you could have things that look a lot like Earth, but it's completely alien and freezing cold landscape. So Titan, they will be sending a mission, the Dragonfly mission, and they're going to use quadcopters. And there are actually people in New Zealand studying some of the chemistry of what they might find there. So that's going to happen as well. They're going to explore the hydrocarbon dunes. Instead of sand, they're made out of hydrocarbon. Crazy. Okay, last thing I want to say is about exoplanets and are we alone? Let's come back to our big question. So NASA says that the ones that are the size of worlds of Earth, they were like science fiction 20 or 30 years ago. Today, thousands of discovery later, astronomers are on the cusp of finding something people have dreamed about for thousands of years, and that is another Earth. And thanks to this Kepler Space Telescope that is now decommissioned, we now have 9,000 potential exoplanets detected in the Milky Way, of which 5,000 are confirmed to be within the Goldilocks zones of their own solar systems, and about 50 of them being Earth-like. in the right, yeah, there's a lot to go on there. There's a lot of weird things like hot Jupiters that are circulating close, orbiting close to the suns and all of that. There's a lot of crazy things going on, but we also know there are quite a few of these potential exoplanets. And the James Webb Space Telescope is starting to turn its amazing systems towards some of these exoplanets, and they're starting to measure exoplanetary atmospheres as we speak. Of course, looking for things like oxygen, water, stuff like that. There are also people like billionaires in Silicon Valley, where I come from, this being one of them, and a bunch of famous scientists, a whole row of them here, who are donating lots of money to listen for extraterrestrials. So this is known as the Breakthrough Initiatives. It's quite well funded. It's based out of UC Berkeley. And in 2015, they started listening more and better, and they still have way more that they've listened, way more parts of space they've listened to, and they haven't heard anything yet. Breakthrough also has the STARSHOT program, which is to go to our next nearest exoplanets in the Alpha Centauri system, 4.37 light years away, and send little nanocrafts with solar sails about the size of a computer chip that might take photos and go to see some of these exoplanets, which they're hoping to get to in the next 30 to 40 years. They want to actually shoot these things out by lasers. So there's a small problem with developing lasers that people don't think are being used for military purposes. So there's an issue with that, because there's certain countries that wouldn't be happy with other countries having giant lasers. But anyway, they want to send thousands of these things out to go to our next solar system nearby. So there you have our solar system, a bunch of pictures of different places we might be able to go look for life. And I hope that gives you some insights on what's going on around here. There's a lot happening, a lot of money being spent, a lot of exciting science happening. And so I will finish there and take any questions. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful that you've come on to talk to us about this. It's yeah, that's been incredible. So thank you.